Dan Silver from the Department of Sociology at University of Toronto, as well as the School of Cities, and also the Urban Genome Project, which is one of the Urban Challenge projects at the School of Cities. We're really excited about today's seminar. This is the first in a series of seminars that we're holding throughout this year, where we're trying to bring scholars in from around the world who are thinking about issues broadly related to some of our themes in the Urban Genome Project. And that has to do with thinking about urban evolution, the way in which we import metaphors from other sciences or other fields into different domains, and what we can learn from those. So with that in mind, we're very pleased to have with us today Dr. Abid Mehmood, who is currently a senior research fellow at the Sustainable Places Research Institute at Cardiff University. He has broad expertise in social innovation, sustainable development, with a research background in climate change, international development, social cohesion for local and regional practice. We also learned in our discussions we've been having so far this morning with Dr. Mehmood that he has a background in PhD in geology. He's studied evolutionary economics. What alerted us to his work was a very interesting paper from a few years ago on different ways that urban scholars have brought different conceptions of even what evolution means into the study of cities, which informed our own thinking in those domains. Today, he's going to be presenting a paper on nature-inspired approaches for integrative urban planning and design. We're going to listen to the paper, and then we'll have some time for comments and discussion around it, which we're really looking forward to. So with that, let me pass it over to Abid, who has, I think, the ability to share his screen and can show us his presentation as well. Abid, take it away. Are you muted? I see. Oh, there you
go. Okay, hello. So I hope I'm audible. Is it okay?
Yes, we hear
you. Okay, perfect, great. First of all, thanks very much to Dan and Mark Fox for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to share whatever I have been doing with the UGP team at the School of Cities. And it's a huge opportunity to actually share with the team some of the, actually learn from them the work they have been doing. It was a huge pleasure also some learning about the current research projects. So a lot of interesting things going on. This work is particularly a reflection of some of the questions which I would like to ask. So I'm not trying to answer any question. I may actually raise some question at the end of the presentation. This is an effort to combine the nature-inspired approaches and learning some lessons in urban planning. Moving on, to start with, before I start the presentation, I would like to refer to this Hippocratic Oath. We all know that all the physicians, when they graduate, they take this Hippocratic Oath, and a development practitioner, Arif Hassan, back in 1983, came up with a Hippocratic Oath for the architects. And I believe that it is very much possible that a similar oath could be taken by the planning practitioners or planners graduating, with, of course, some modifications, because you can, as you can see, it's exclusively for the architects. So moving on, the main purpose of this presentation is there are twofold objectives. First, what is the importance of nature-inspired approaches in urban planning, and how could such approaches help in achieving broader sustainability objectives? in terms of the key arguments, we know that the use of metaphors is not new in urban planning and architecture and design. The need is to explore new relationships between people, places, and spaces. And there are certain issues that the current trends, mainly in planning, they tend to look at the optimal efficiency, optimizing the efficiency, economic activity, productivity of the built environment. And most of the experiences copied from nature are aimed with such objectives. So we should be a bit cautious with these kind of approaches. My take is that we should take a holistic view to the size of cities. We should be mindful of the needs of the citizens, look at much more socially inclusive activities, policies and planning practices. And also something which is much more important is the empowerment of the community. So making communities be feeling and being part of the planning process. So in some perspectives on the nature inspirations, and this and next few slides will develop and contextualize the need and use of the inspirations from nature. First of all, this is how scientists formulate metaphors about specific issues and questions relating to nature is determined by the structures and habits of thought peculiar to that particular time. So we see at different points of time in history, the nature and use of metaphors has evolved or changed, and it reflects how people thought in those times. Then these habits and structures are also preconceptual because they were hypothesized, or their epistemology was based on human-nature relations on those contemporary norms and trends which were existing at that time. And so they actually preceded the theory, analysis, and policy. One such example is the social Darwinism, which is sometimes seen as a way to justify the conflict and conquest, the imperialist motives, and how the sociological principles were actually derived from biology using organic analogies and to actually making excuses or building new methodological linkages. So there are certain conceptual dichotomies which we can observe when we are borrowing or when we are trying to create some transdisciplinary linkages between different fields. For example, in this case, planning and natural sciences. John Forster's work on planning in the face of power is quite interesting in this sense that he refers to the role of planning ethics and how planners could become sources of misinformation, mismanagement of citizens' knowledge, consent, trust, and attention. But on the other hand, planners could also anticipate and counteract sources of misinformation and that threaten public serving democratic processes. Similarly, Margot Huxley's work looks at the ordered and chaotic aspects of the spatial rationalities. She refers to those rationalities as the imperialist logics of cities, looking at cities as unruly places with threats of chaos, disorder, poverty, disease. On the other hand, city also becomes a symbol of order, harmony, happiness, health, and well-being. More biophilic or biomimetic works, they look at the relationship between the living and non-living aspects and how the non-living aspects could be improved by looking at the evolution patterns or design features of the living organisms. And finally, there is also the dichotomy between the mechanistic principles, which are based on the physical and deterministic terms, as against the organic principles, which are based on the incremental adjustment and adaptation to the challenging situations or the environments. So in terms of the cognitive relations, there are two pathways which we could identify in the context of cities. One we could call top-down, which is much more explicate order or form based on the geometrical forms of the cities, they could be planned or imposed, as some would argue. On the other hand, there is much more bottom-up implicate order or form, which allows organic emergence of the cities. So growth in that sense is much more spontaneous. It's slow, it takes time, and it is not entirely predictable. It also shapes the city in accordance with the features which are available over the time, how the cities are facing, what kind of natural opportunities or disasters or other aspects do the cities face. It also reflects a certain extent of complexity and self-organization of the flows of the cities. So in this sense, we can see, we can address two questions: that nature-inspired urban planning, can it be called as more conscious emulation and abstraction from nature, or is it more of an imitation of natural forms and processes? So in terms of conscious emulation, we can learn, we are constantly learning from nature, but not really copying the traits. But in the imitation sense, we are looking at the mimicking the forms or features or processes. So in nature, materials, according to Pauline, materials are expensive, but the design is cheap. And we can see that application of natural systems in planning, it can be cyclical, it could be a spiral, it could also be chaotic. So the inspirations from nature, they require a profound understanding of the ecosystems that involves translations, which we could use in the Calonian sense as well. And then the product which results from those processes, they may not necessarily be of the same shape and size as was initially intended. So what kind of challenges do we face when taking inspirations from nature? They can be challenges in terms of the organic urban form, which can be seen by planners as irregular or unpredictable. Planners are usually, they tend to strive to bring regularity, predictability and control when translating nature-based inspirations, and planning in itself, in its very definition, tends to be able to foresee the future growth of the city. Abstractions can also be a means to simplify the transfer by adopting the key principles from nature. So instead of, again, copying the form or functions, it's important to look at the key features of the natural systems before making any attempt to learn from them. So the nature-inspired views, they can often fail to consider human emotions, desires. So when copying from nature, we need to be very mindful, very careful about not looking at how humans interact with nature. So humans over the years, how they have dealt with nature, they have been selectively breeding different species. The agriculture is a good example, how there's been things are produced at the industrial scale, how humans have contributed in moving species across the continents. In many cases, the host species failed to adopt, or the invasive species took control. Similarly, how the human instinct can actually be repulsive towards nature. as in some cases, many of the animals, plant species, they have actually become extinct because humans, they found them either harmful, hazardous, invasive, or simply they didn't like it. Many of the pet breeds we can see, many of the dog breeds we can see, which they became extinct because they were not seen conducive to being kept as pets. And one of the example of how humans interact with the environment is the global biodiversity decline, which has been over 58% according to Living Planet Index. So taking more of a realistic approach, we'll have to understand that the transfer of concepts or processes between living and non-living systems is not simple, or it's not straightforward. And as according to some estimates, it's up to only 12% of similarity can be achieved between biology and technology if we want to, if in the case of adapting from the natural systems. So the perception of a city or the nature of a city has also evolved over time. If we look back in the history, the ideal city was perceived as a perfect body in the Renaissance period in the 14th to the 17th centuries Europe. And the same perspective shifted to a diseased body, which was facing problem in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, and pollution is spreading in the cities. And so cities became the breeding grounds of disease and pollution. Geddes and Mumford's approach to biotechniques is one which uses synthesis or manipulation of the living organism through the application of science and engineering to create products which are useful to the humans. More recently, biophilia, which was coined by Edward Wilson, looks at the emotional affiliation of humans to the other living organisms as part of the human nature. So to Wilson, it's in the nature of humans to be very emotionally attached to the nature. But how about the cities? When we are talking about the cities, it's interesting to see how the perception or the image of city has evolved. We can agree to disagree with this quote, but it is a fact that many of the world cities or the global cities, they are playing key roles in the economy, in the environment, but also in terms of pollution. So if we look at the trends, the growth trends, we see that the global urban population has been rising. There were 3 megacities in 1975, and according to some projections, there will be over 40 megacities before we reach 2030. So there are different factors which define how the cities have been. The number of cities has been rising, and the populations, the urban population, have been increasing. We can see there are challenges also which cities are facing. Cities are also contributing to the agriculture practices, industrial agriculture, industrial intensification, and intensification in agriculture is taking place. So while the footprint of a city does not remain confined within its boundaries, but actually it is quite global. Cities are also the major contributors of the environmental pollution. They are playing a major role in the environmental crisis. They are also the major players in the loss of territorial and marine resources. So even the effect of the cities does not remain confined to the lands, but also marine resources. And we also see that with these challenges, new approaches are emerging, such as eco-friendly or eco-intelligent planning. But to what extent these are practical, it still remains to be seen. On the other hand, we also see that cities are becoming a source of poverty. So poverty is increasingly becoming urbanized. It does not remain confined to the rural spaces or smaller cities. Over 1 billion people are living in the slums, which makes 1 out of 3 urban dwellers. Cities are increasingly becoming resource hungry. They are heavily relying on their hinterland, which is increasing day by day. And these do not remain confined to global north or south. It is a global phenomena. Local and regional disparities are also increasing. So rise of the cities also tip the balance of regions, but also at the national level. In many of the countries, larger cities take the larger chunk of the resources, and they have to prioritize because of economic activity, financial activity they are producing. There are also population movements and displacements taking place with the high density and causing resource constraints. Also, the buildings, land use practices, social relations, the whole culture of the cities is also changing. So if we are to consider the aspects of emulation or imitation, we see that simple imitation of objects, processes, or systems from nature does not signify adaptation as relevant and sustainable in the longer term. Also ignorance of social political factors, economic aspirations, political inertia, power struggles, and institutional assets and capacities occurs when we try to emulate or imitate from the nature. So using a more of a metaphorical approach, using metaphors rather than mimicking from nature, it still brings its own benefits. So we are mindful of our impacts on the nature. So, and we can look at the scale or scale of the impact, how it improves social relations, how we can develop common languages and actually use a much more localized or place-based view. It can also help urban planners to engage with the socio-political, economic agendas and cultural environmental challenges such as the climate change, how the cities are taking steps to reduce their environmental footprint. We see in the form of promoting walking and cycling, active transport in the cities, improving public transport mobility, but also other ways of reducing the carbon footprint of the cities while adapting to the changing environment. So to summarize, the self-regulatory character of the organisms or the nature means that traits from the nature cannot be simply replicated into planning terms. Instead of transfusing ideas, designs, and practices, these should be adapted to local conditions. So what we call place-based approach. But we should be also cautious about the nature's inspirations, which might also be used as justification by some to promote selective enhancement of the built environment only through those natural features that are beneficial to the humans. So we should be careful that we do not just pick the relevant justifications for nature, but also learn from the evolution of the nature. Finally, some questions which are worth looking for answer of. So when we talk about implicate and explicate orders, so is there something in between? Can we find any hybrid forms in which we are able to interact with nature much more easily and in much more environment-friendly ways? Is there a way between top-down policies and bottom-up grassroots movements? What are the pathways where we can actually find a blend between the two and actually work with the communities and planners and the policymakers and the politicians? So the socio-political empowerment concept stays there. Metaphors in which cities emerge and sustain in a complex adaptive way. So we should look at cities as complex evolving systems with many smaller systems functioning in between, within, and how they can actually contribute to a better relationship between humans and nature. So humans are much more conscious of their impact on the nature, not only the nature which exists in the cities, not just the trees and flora and fauna in the city, but also outside the city, and their long-range impacts in other parts of the world. And this can actually help to promote a sustainable built environment through creativity, innovation, and adaptive solutions with nature for resource utilization, energy conservation, waste management, using materials, structure, systems, and design. So there are many opportunities which are happening at the architecture level in urban design issues, but also there's opportunity for planners to actually learn and adopt from these changes and take the opportunity of learning from nature and bring it, apply it into the planning practice. So I will stop here and I will hand over to Dan.
Okay, thank you. That was really fascinating, interesting presentation. I think we've got some time now for conversation or questions. So I think we'll just kind of open up the floor. People can just, how should we do it? Can either raise your digital hand using the little function on there, or just unmute yourself and say I want to talk, and we can have your question. But if you've got any questions or comments you want to make, just sort of let us know, either again, like say it in the chat, or do one of the little raise hand things, or just make yourself known.